Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Hi, X. Have you ever encountered something demonic? I wanted to tell you maybe the scariest real story I have to tell. I've been a lurker on this board for years, but never had the courage to write this story out until now. Some of the details aren't scary on their own, but all of them put together is something that took me years to confront and, more importantly, accept as the truth. I guess I should just take it from the top. If I am sort of all over the place with this story, I apologize. I'm not much of a writer. Anyways, here goes. Be me in the 7th grade. Early 2010s. Have two best friends. Austin, who is a few months older than me, our friend who was taller than both myself and Gavin. Austin led a very difficult home life from the few times he gave us any details, and we didn't ever visit his house. Gavin was my best friend, the youngest of the group by a few months, a neighbor buddy that lived 7 or 8 houses down and across the street. Gavin lived with a single mother who was really nice. She was a very well-off real estate agent, but would frequently be home because she would get sick a lot. Maybe once or twice a year she would be out for a few weeks. Anyways, this was the days of the early 2010s. We lived in a small town in Ohio. All of us grew up pretty poor and were doing the best we could under Ohio circumstances. Most of our summers were spent running around outside, exploring abandoned shit in the cursed Ohio woods. One that time we found a set of working walkie-talkies abandoned in a box with some chargers outside of a Radio Shack, and bought Austin his own matching one later on so that we could all talk whenever we wanted to. Not like my parents really cared what time I went to bed anyways. My home life was weird. I knew I didn't have it that bad, but I couldn't help comparing myself to Austin's family whenever I came home. Everyone was always buried in their own devices and never gave me attention. But not at Gavin's house. At Gavin's, his mom made us feel like we were always at home. She was the kind of mom that would keep the fridge stocked with a ton of Mountain Dews and cherry Pepsi, because that's what we liked. During our sleepovers, she would let us stay up until whenever, playing as much Medal of Honor as we could stay awake for. I remember going out on a normal Friday with Austin and Gavin in Gavin's mom's van. Gavin's mom was driving a little slow and kept scratching her hair as we drove. I wouldn't have noticed myself, but I saw Gavin staring at his mom like she was a bomb about to explode. She told us to go grab whatever we wanted and she would wait in the car. She seemed extremely anxious to leave. We went inside, looked around, grabbed the scariest movies we could find and headed to the front. When we got there, a teenage douchebag employee smiled and told us we can't rent anything that is rated R without an adult. Tell him about Gavin's mom having an agreement with the last employee about letting her son grab rated R movies basically whenever with her approval. The douchebag teen smiles a horrible smile and tells us that said employee no longer worked there and he didn't care, we needed an adult. Austin tells Gavin to just go grab his mom real quick. Gavin stares at us. Shitting bricks.jpg. After another person got in line behind us, Gavin finally decided to grab his mom to check out for us. I'm not going to write everything out, but basically his mom came in, took one look at the guy and went berserk.
My son buys whatever he wants here, that's how it's always been.
Smirk quickly dissolves from the douche teen's face. He says they have to have an adult present for every rental for those movies or something like that. She loses it, begins pushing stuff off the desk and yelling. This went on for a few minutes. She began verbally attacking the employee until tears began forming in his eyes. It gets so bad the guy tells her she needs to leave and that he is calling the police. This seems to snap her out of it. Her eyes grew wide as she looked around her and saw the destruction she'd caused.
Gavin, in the car, with your friends, now.
We drove home and didn't talk the whole way there. We got to the street Austin always ensured we left him at and didn't follow him past. Gavin's mom looked at us in the seat as she stopped the car to let him out.
I am so sorry for what happened back there in the store, boys. That was unacceptable.
She then looked forward and began crying. Austin looks at us as if to say, "What the hell, man?" and hopped out of the car. I rode home with them in silence, extremely unnerved. That night as I sat in my room, wondering what was going on with Gavin's mom, my radio crackled to life with Gavin's voice.
Hey, you guys there.
20 seconds later, Austin replies in a very worried voice.
What happened today, dude?
Gavin didn't reply, just told us he wouldn't be able to play for a few weeks and couldn't talk on his radio. As he finished his last sentence, I heard a terrifying wail come from Gavin's radio. I recognized the voice as his mother. The only noise I've ever heard that was anywhere near similar was when my wife and I were in the delivery room, delivering our son, and the woman next door had delivered a dead baby and was so emotionally distraught. The wails of Gavin's mom sounded more intense. She was wailing like someone who was in true anguish, living hell. After this, things changed for a while. We didn't talk for a few weeks after this, and Gavin was ignoring us at school. He looked so tired all the time, like he was awake for hours on end at home. He also wasn't packing a lunch, and we noticed his clothes seemed unwashed. He had an overall odor like death. I stole some change from my parents' dresser one morning and took it to school. I used it to buy Gavin a lunch, as he hadn't eaten lunch all week at school. I grabbed Austin and walked over to Gavin, offering him the tray while he sat by himself at the furthest corner table alone, sulking. He looked at us for 1 second and grabbed the tray I had offered him. We each took our places across from Gavin as he ate. He inhaled all of the chicken nuggets, corn, and chocolate milk before me, and Austin had even touched our food.
What is going on with you, man?
Gavin tells us that he will tell us on the bus ride home, and quickly leaves. Later that afternoon we got on the bus and sat down in the very back, like we always did. Gavin, true to his word, sat down next to Austin in the row seat, with me right next to him, and said,
"Look, I'm only telling you guys this once, then we drop it."
Austin and I nodded in agreement. Gavin begins telling me and Austin all the details about his home life. His mother had been to multiple psychiatrists over the years to treat some very serious mental conditions she had begun having. I guess things started small. She would leave the fridge open or walk the dog and get a little bit lost. It was like that for months, not progressing or anything, until she came down one morning to prepare Gavin breakfast as she always did. That morning, however, she walked downstairs and poured an entire gallon of milk down the sink and told Gavin to have a good day before she locked herself in the garage. Gavin told us that when he got off the bus the afternoon of the milk incident, she was still in the garage, talking to someone, but there was no voice answering her or anything. Austin and I looked at each other, wondering if he was screwing with us, but he looked dead serious. I was terrified, secretly believing every word. Gavin pressed on and continued telling his story. A few months after those incidents, Gavin told me that she began walking around at night, sneaking into his bedroom and watching him sleep while she swayed in the dark, only her white nightgown visible. She would constantly hum creepy songs and walk around at 2 or 3 in the morning. Told us that the night before the video rental incident, his mom had stood over his bed and didn't leave. He sat there all night in the dark. He said the first thing he saw through his squinted eyes as the sun rose was the gleam of his mother's vacant eyes staring into him as he slept. She looked extremely upset and disheveled. He said his eyes twitched a little bit, and she could see him looking at her. However, she never commented on him looking at her. He waited a few minutes and made a big show of waking up. The second his eyes opened, his mom said in a really disengaged customer service voice,
"Gavin, you're awake. Glad I came in when I woke you."
He said that she stared through him, and he got up and walked past her to go downstairs. She didn't move and stared where he used to be laying on the bed. Gavin's story had completely ruined our day, but it wasn't over yet. Nothing could have prepared us for what we saw next as our bus pulled up to the designated stop. Gavin's mom had her car parked outside. The car itself was fine, but she was not. She sat in the front seat of the car, hair horribly buzz-cut in patches with completely unshaven patches throughout it. She had hair on her dress and neck and all over the interior of the car. Her lipstick was smeared on her face and on the front of her teeth, mascara smeared too, with indications of crying, as the hollow eyes stared at the 3 of us exiting the bus. There must have been at least 7 or 8 other kids getting off at our stop. Gavin was embarrassed and refused to acknowledge her. She grew very distressed.
"Look at me, Gavin. I am your mother."
She suddenly stopped yelling and began laughing hysterically. I guess the bus driver ended up calling the police because we heard them pretty quickly on our way home, Gavin deciding to walk past his mother and catching up to us. She was institutionalized after that for quite a few months and was apparently given a new prescription that was working pretty well. I really, and I mean really, wish this was how it all ended. On a good note, with her receiving the help she needed and moving forward with her life. But unfortunately, most stories don't ever have a good ending in the real world, so we are stuck with the horrific reality of what I'm going to describe next. Gavin's aunt moved in and began taking care of Gavin full-time. She was nice, but wouldn't let us get away with murder, as Gavin's mother had. We still kept up on the walkie-talkies at night and would tell each other ghost stories until we were too tired to continue talking. One night, Gavin is telling us a story and tells us to wait. He said he saw something from his bedroom window, creeping around his backyard, but that it was gone now. We all joked that it was a ghost from one of our stories and continued to talk late into the night. It was a weekend, so Gavin's aunt would let Austin and I stay the night over the next day. We all agreed to go to sleep so we could hang out quicker. The next day I woke up, told my parents I was headed to Gavin's for the night, and brought my pillow, toothbrush, and snuck a few R-rated R movies from my parents' entertainment stand and headed out. When I got there, Austin and Gavin were already playing Black Ops Zombies in the basement. I ran down there and showed them the movies I grabbed. Fast forward to that night. All of us laying down watching a scary movie. Austin gets up and tells us he's going to the bathroom and to not pause the movie as he hoped it would be over before he got back. We laughed at him and kept the movie going. A few minutes after he had gone upstairs, we heard the unmistakable thumping of his heavy feet slamming down the stairs. He slammed the door that led to the basement behind him and ran to the couch between Gavin and I.
There's footprints on the deck outside.
Austin practically yelled when he sat down. Your aunt is in her room and no one else is here. Gavin and I went upstairs and looked. Sure enough, there were a set of footprints in the snow leading up to the glass sliding door in the kitchen. We stared at each other, then both ran upstairs to the room his aunt was staying in. We told her what we saw and she said that she needed to call the police and asked where Austin was. When she heard he was downstairs, she looked very scared but went to bring him upstairs with us. We heard her creep down the stairs and a few minutes later, her and Austin returned to the room. The police arrived shortly, which gave everyone the courage to look around the house. Gavin went back upstairs and shouted. We followed the police to his bedroom, where we saw a set of wet footprints, leading from an open window to Gavin's bed. At that moment, Austin, Gavin, and I knew who it had to be. We told the police and Gavin's aunt the bedroom story, and the police looked extremely disturbed and began talking on their radios. Another car pulled up and the first set of officers briefed them, then headed to what I presume was the mental facility his mother was being held at, which was about 15 minutes away at this point. The second set of officers seemed more seasoned. They told us not to be worried, and we relaxed a little. I'm not sure they were allowed to do this, but the police really wanted us to calm down after this altercation, and began radioing the other officers at the institution as we listened to their conversation. The other set of officers talk on the walkie-talkie and tell our officers that they were there and were gathering information. The other officers were in the room where Gavin's mom was sleeping and began telling us everything seemed to check out. As the other officers were ready to leave the room where Gavin's mom was, the older cop grabbed the radio from the rookie.
Hey, check her feet. What do they feel like?
Sergeant, they're freezing cold.
Ask the hospital for the video recordings and make sure she is secured inside that facility.
Yes, Sergeant.
The police sat in the room with us and continued to comfort Gavin. I'm not sure if it was out of fear or what, but that was when Gavin began telling us a story that would make both officers extremely concerned.
Since we know my mom has escaped from the institution in the freezing cold, managed to scale our house and enter through my bedroom window, and do all of this completely unaffected, I feel like we should tell you about what happened.
Gavin's aunt spoke over him.
I don't think you need to tell that story. It was an art project or something.
Gavin began telling his story despite his aunt's protests. Last summer, Gavin was staying at his dad's for the summer and apparently told his dad about some of the stuff his mom did, and Gavin's father knew exactly what Gavin was referring to. Apparently, Gavin's dad had met her when they were both very young. Gavin's mom had suffered horrible abuse at the hands of her parents and was extremely cautious with relationships going forward. I guess to get out of the situation with her parents, she met up with a group of girls that she knew from high school. They were really shitty to her in high school, but suddenly accepted her to the group. She was surprised, but happy to have a friend group and someone to talk to about her home situation. Over the course of a few months, they began only giving Gavin's mother attention if she did things correctly.
Don't do your hair like that, do it like this. Don't talk to those people. Stop acting like a prude all the time.
Things like that. Gavin's mom realized she was simply being abused by a different group of people than her parents right now, but was happy that she was at least being accepted by someone, so she continued to hang out with her. After she slowly became submissive to this group of women, they continued to control her more and more. One day, they led her out into the woods of northeastern Ohio and began joking around about trying her to a tree. She joked that it would be funny and should try it, until realized the other girls had stopped dead in their tracks and were staring at her completely seriously. They began tying her extremely tight, and she cried out loudly. Then they gagged her and wrapped a bag over her head, loose enough to allow oxygen to pass through, but not much. Apparently, as she was sitting there, she was hit in the head with a large stick of some sort and the other girls laughed.
Is she out? Shit, she'd better hope she's dead. I wouldn't want to survive what happens next.
Then another smack from a log and she blacked out. When she woke up, she was in a really confined space. She looked around her and realized she couldn't move her hands or feet and was in a space that sealed her body very tightly. This space compressed her shoulders together, and her head was being pushed into as well. It was almost as if this space was designed for someone smaller than she was. When she was finally released, she realized that she was still in the woods, but in a cabin, in a small confined space under the floor, upon which usually sat a bed, but now the bed had been moved to a space in front of the door, barring her escape. In front of her sat a burly man, with overalls and a large beard. He punched her in the face repeatedly, and smeared the blood from her busted mouth onto his tattoo, smiling down at her. The next few weeks went the same, however. Now she was able to leave the cabin to be tied to the nearest tree outside, and would be shackled to the bed when they realized she wouldn't survive very long in the compartment under the bed. She paid great attention to her surroundings, and apparently was able to escape after 5 or 6 weeks in total. Being used as a slave for a local coven had damaged her mentally. A while later, she met Gavin's father and had been able to suppress the memories, but would cry out some nights, remembering animal blood being poured on her and books read over her by men in robes with masks, carrying small daggers. Gavin's dad had finally had enough and left when Gavin was only a year or 2 old. Gavin wrapped this story up and began crying. The older, more seasoned officer held him and began consoling him.
I've seen evil, son. I've seen it face to face, and I know what you are trying to tell me is going on here. A demonic thing, right?
Gavin nodded, tears streaming down his eyes. Gavin mustered his voice together and said,
That night, when she was whispering by my bed, she said I needed to be purified by fire.
At that moment, my mom picked me up and drove me home. I do not remember calling her that day, so I guess Gavin's aunt must have placed the call. A few months later, Gavin's mom had finally been given a timeline as to when she would be leaving, due to remarkable progress being made at the institution she was at. Gavin was excited. It was 8 weeks away if his mom kept her progress going. It was in those last few weeks that I began walking the dog my dad had just brought home. This week, my parents were working late, so I would just walk with the dog until I got tired, and then go home to bed. Tonight was different. As I was walking back home, I passed Gavin's house. His garage door was lifted slightly up, with a pair of pale bare feet inside covered in mud and grass. I ran home with the dog as quickly and quietly as possible. I radioed Gavin and Austin as I ran back over to his house. Gavin didn't answer, but Austin did. He told me he had already called the police. As I made my way back to Gavin's, I saw Austin running down the street towards me, in pure panic. Austin and I went to the garage door and knelt down, as it was open about 2 feet high, and looked inside. The door leading into the home from inside the garage was ajar. Austin and I went to the front of the house and looked into the window that was above Gavin's couch in the living room. Gavin's mom was in the living room with a can of gasoline dousing the couches and leaning into the kitchen to pour more on the floor. Austin and I panicked and ran into the house from the garage door and sprinted into Gavin's room. He was hiding in his closet with the radio in his hand, and we realized he must have been whispering to us in the radio or something, and because our volume was so low, it just wasn't picking up his voice. We grabbed Gavin up and looked out the window for a possible escape route. We heard something creak in the hallway and saw Gavin's mom in her hospital gown looking around the corner of the stairs into the room. She was maybe 6.5 feet away and had the scariest look on her face. The only way I could describe it is just pure bloodlust and excitement. She was licking the front of her teeth and breathing very rapidly, and the breaths continued to get louder and louder as she prepared herself to kill the 3 of us. I can't even take credit for this, as, if it were up to my reflexes, we would all 3 have died that night. Austin leapt forward to close the door, and just as he did we saw Gavin's mom for a full second. She had slipped out from behind the wall she was peeking from, and revealed a large kitchen knife in her hand as she bolted towards us. Austin slammed the door just in time, and managed to hold the door closed while Gavin's mom slammed her full body weight against it. She was shrieking like a banshee, just banging against it over and over again.
Gavin, 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 Gavin.
The pounding grows louder. Then suddenly, silence. We managed to wedge the door closed and looked out at the window, our only escape at this point.
Gavin.
The voice sounded like his mom, no screaming or shrieking. I heard what sounded like her sitting down against the door. Then she began sobbing silently.
Gavin, I'm sorry, please just come out here. I can hold you, Gavin. I can hold you and everything will be okay again, even if it's just for a few seconds, please.
As I write this, I am beginning to realize why I suppressed these memories for so long. I'm so sorry, guys. I'm really trying to hold it together and get this story out. This is so emotionally tolling. Gavin began crying and half-heartedly moved towards the door, but Austin quickly wrapped him up and pulled him to the ground. We all moved towards the window and managed to quickly drop down to the patio below and ran out front to see cop cars and ambulances flying towards us. The rest is sort of a blur. She managed to light a match outside of the room, but only had gasoline on her hands and fingers, so it lit her on fire and her alone. When her body was found, she was outside Gavin's room and had burned alive. It seems as though one hand held the door and the other one was reaching towards the stairs, towards the gasoline at the bottom of them, and she died like that, presumably fighting a demon that told her to spread the fire and kill everyone in the house, and resisted while burning alive, and stayed outside her son's room to make sure we weren't hurt. A final act of rebellion against whatever was destroying life. Austin and I still talk, and I have been back to that town to have some beers with them a few times. Unfortunately, Gavin's aunt has passed since then, and neither Austin or Gavin really remember the events very well, but I do. God damn it, I won't ever forget any detail of this. A few months after these events, I went out to a tree fort the three of us had built when we were a few years younger. Sitting neatly inside our fort were a few cans of Mountain Dew and cherry Pepsi. A few of those cosmic brownies in a bag next to them too. The bag had a note inside that said,
Sorry things have been so tough lately, boys. I'm trying my best.
I will never forget Gavin's mom and how strong she must have been to keep literal demons at bay for as long as she did.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.